The royal palace courtyard was always full of life. Guards in shining armor stood tall. Servants moved quickly with trays and scrolls, and visitors from faraway lands passed through the tall gates. Among the guards was a man known as the Black Royal Guard. His armor was darker than the night sky, and he carried himself with quiet strength. People respected him, not just because of his skill, but because of the calm way he faced every situation. On a warm afternoon, something unusual happened. A man walked into the courtyard, his face marked by anger and pride. His name was Darren, a former officer of the Royal Guard. Years ago, Darren had been a powerful man in this very palace. He had given orders, trained soldiers, and walked these same grounds with pride. But those days were gone. He had been dismissed for reasons people no longer spoke of. Though his uniform was long gone, the bitterness in his heart remained. Darren's eyes locked onto the Black Royal Guard standing near the entrance to the inner chambers. For a moment he hesitated, remembering his own days of glory. But anger quickly pushed those memories aside. He marched straight toward the guard, his steps loud on the stone floor. Without a greeting or any sign of respect, Darren pointed at the guard and spoke sharply. "Leave this place," he ordered. "You do not belong here." The words cut through the peaceful air like a blade. Nearby servants paused, unsure if they should keep moving. Other guards glanced at each other, surprised by the scene. It was clear that Darren was trying to show power he no longer had. The Black Royal Guard did not move. His hands rested calmly by his sides, and his tall figure remained steady. His face was hidden behind the dark helmet, but even without seeing his expression, people could sense his calm. It was a silence heavier than any shouted reply. People nearby began to whisper. Some recognized Darren. The silence in the courtyard grew heavier as Darren's words echoed in the air. He stood with his chest puffed out, expecting the Black Royal Guard to retreat, to show fear or hesitation. But the guard didn't move. He didn't flinch. The crowd could feel the tension, the battle of wills happening in the open space. Darren's face reddened with frustration. He had spent years commanding men, giving orders that were followed without question. He had been powerful, respected, and now here he was, standing before a soldier he considered beneath him, yet receiving no sign of obedience. This was not how things were supposed to go. "Do you hear me?" Darren's voice cracked with a mix of anger and disbelief. His hand, trembling with irritation, waved in front of the guard's face as if trying to push through the calm barrier that stood before him. "I said leave now." The Black Royal Guard remained as still as ever. His body was a stone, his eyes hidden, his posture unchanged. There was no fear, no anger, just complete stillness. To anyone watching, it seemed as though he was a statue, perfectly placed in the center of the courtyard. His calmness, in that moment, seemed almost too much to bear for Darren. The onlookers were silent, each person afraid to break the tension. They had all heard the stories of the Black Royal Guard, how he was trained to face impossible odds with grace, how he had been chosen by the crown not just for strength, but for a rare inner peace that could never be broken. Today, that calm was being tested by a man who had once been one of their leaders, a man who had lost everything. "You're nothing but a puppet," Darren spat, stepping forward, his boots making loud, angry thuds against the stone. "You think you're above me now?" Darren walked away from the Black Royal Guard, his steps growing faster with each passing moment. The weight of the failure hung heavy on his shoulders, but his pride kept him from turning around. The voices of the crowd murmured behind him, their eyes following his every move, but he ignored them. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had expected to regain control, to show the guard his place, but instead, he had been ignored, dismissed without a single word. As Darren hurried through the palace courtyard, he could feel the eyes of the onlookers on him. They had seen everything: his anger, his attempt to reclaim power, and the calm way the Black Royal Guard had crushed his challenge. It was as if the entire world had watched him fail. The whispers around him were like cold winds, cutting through what little was left of his confidence. What happened to him? One servant whispered to another. He was once so powerful, so respected. "He's nothing now," the other replied softly, glancing at the retreating figure of Darren. "He's just another man who lost his place. The Black Royal Guard, he's different. He's not like any of us." The words stung Darren's ears, even though they weren't meant for him. He could hear the judgment in their voices. They were right. He had lost everything, his rank, his power, and now his dignity. The man who had once stood at the front of the royal guard, commanding loyalty, was now nothing more than a figure of scorn. Darren pushed through the tall doors of the courtyard and into the quieter halls of the palace. The stone walls seemed to close in on him as his mind raced with anger and frustration. How had he fallen so far? How had this once proud officer been reduced to this? The memories of this time as a leader flooded his mind. He remembered the respect he used to command, the soldiers who would follow his every order. He remembered how the Black Royal Guard had once been just another soldier under his command, someone who had looked up to him. And now here he was, dismissed from duty and humiliated by the very man he had once overseen. He stopped in the middle of a long corridor, his breath shallow and quick. The weight of what had just happened seemed unbearable. He was a man who had once been everything, and now he was nothing. The sting of being ignored, of having his pride shattered, made his chest tighten. No one had ever treated him like that before, not even his worst enemies. His thoughts swirled like a storm, and in that moment, he felt a deep sense of loss. Darren had never imagined his fall would be like this, so public, so complete. In his mind, he had always thought that power was something that could be regained. But now, standing in the quiet palace hall, he realized how wrong he had been. He turned away, hoping the walls could shield him from the shame that followed. Darren leaned against the cold stone wall of the palace hallway, his breath still shaky from the storm of emotions inside him. He had never felt so exposed, so defeated. The moment he had left the courtyard, the whispers had followed him, echoing in his mind. But the Black Royal Guard's silence had been the most crushing of all. It was as if the man had seen through every layer of pride and anger, and with just a calm presence, he had brought Darren to his knees without lifting a finger. He closed his eyes, trying to push the memory away, but it lingered, sharp and painful. The way the guard had stood there, unmoving, unaffected by the shouting and the insults. Darren had expected some kind of response, even a little anger, some sign that he had been heard, but the guard hadn't given him that. He had given nothing, and that nothing had crushed him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had been someone once. He had been respected. The Black Royal Guard's calmness wasn't just about duty. It was about something deeper, something Darren no longer had. He pushed himself off the wall, determined to not let his weakness show. The shame was unbearable, but he couldn't let it define him. Not now. He needed to regain control of himself. Maybe there was still a way to turn this around, to show the palace that he wasn't just a fallen officer. But as he walked further into the quiet halls, Darren realized something else. The palace wasn't just silent, it was waiting for him to fail, to show weakness again. The people who had once respected him now whispered behind his back, no longer seeing him as the strong officer he had been. They saw him as nothing more than a shadow, a man who had lost his place and could never get it back. He passed a few servants along the way, their heads lowered as he walked by. None of them dared to look him in the eye. It was as if they were afraid to acknowledge him, as if his fall from grace had become a thing of legend already. He had been a symbol of power, and now he was a symbol of failure. Darren clenched his fists, the frustration rising again. The Black Royal Guard had won. He hadn't needed to fight back, to say anything. All he had done was stand still, and that was enough to remind Darren of his place in the world now. And yet, the guard's victory wasn't the real sting. The real sting was the way the world had watched him lose. The crowd had seen it, and worse, they had all agreed. Darren was no longer someone who commanded respect. He was a man who had lost it, and there was no easy way to get it back. He could feel his heart pounding, the anger growing again. But this time it wasn't just anger at the guard, it was anger at himself, at the choices he had made, at the pride that had led him here. He had been so sure of himself, so sure he could still command respect. But now, standing alone in the palace halls, he realized that respect wasn't something you could force. Not anymore. Not in this world. Darren's steps echoed through the empty hallway as he walked deeper into the palace. His mind was racing, each thought a sharp turn in a maze of anger, regret, and shame. He had never felt so small. The walls of the palace, once a place where he had stood tall, now seemed to close in on him. Each corner, each shadow, reminded him of his fall from grace. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but there was no anger left to fight with. The sting of defeat had washed over him, and it was like drowning in slow motion. The Black Royal Guard's calmness had cut through him in a way that nothing else ever had. There was no mockery in the guard's eyes, no challenge in his stance, just quiet, steady strength. It wasn't about power or authority anymore. It was about something Darren could no longer reach, something he had lost and couldn't get back. He paused near the grand staircase, his fingers lightly brushing the stone railing. Memories flooded back of when he had once walked these halls with confidence, when his name was spoken with respect. He had been a man of importance, trusted by the crown, feared by enemies, admired by those beneath him. And now that man was gone, replaced by a bitter stranger whose every step seemed weighed down by regret. The whispers of the crowd in the courtyard played over and over in his mind. They had seen him fall. They had seen his desperate attempt to command the Black Royal Guard, and they had seen how easily it had failed. Darren wasn't just defeated by a soldier. He had been defeated by the truth. He was no longer the man he once was. He could still hear the words of the crowd as they quietly discussed his past. He was once so powerful. He's nothing now. Those words stabbed deeper than any insult. They weren't just observations. They were facts, harsh and undeniable. Darren couldn't hide from them. No matter how hard he tried, the truth was that he had lost everything that had once made him important. The more he thought about it, the more the weight of it all pressed down on him. The Black Royal Guard hadn't humiliated him. He had simply stood there, silent and steady, and in doing so, had shown Darren what he had failed to see before. His pride, his power, his control, it was all gone. The guard's silence wasn't just a refusal to obey. It was a statement. It was a reminder of the dignity that Darren could no longer claim. His breathing grew shallow. Darren wanted to scream, to lash out, but it was pointless. There was nothing left to fight for. The fight had already been won, and he had lost. He turned away from the stairs and began walking slowly toward the outer chambers of the palace. His eyes were downcast, his shoulders heavy. The sound of his footsteps was the only thing that filled the space around him. He wasn't just walking through the palace anymore. He was walking through the memory of who he had been, and each step felt like a reminder that he was no longer that man. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. He was a different man now, and there was no going back. Darren stood by the palace window, staring out at the garden below. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The flowers bloomed in bright colors, but none of it seemed to matter. Everything felt distant now, as if he was watching it all through a fog. His mind kept returning to the moment in the courtyard, to the Black Royal Guard's silence. The guard had done nothing but stand there, and in that simple act, he had taken everything from Darren. He had been an officer once, trusted by the crown, feared by enemies. He had commanded soldiers who followed his orders without question. His name had been spoken with respect. People had looked up to him, and he had held that power close, like a shield that protected him from the world. But now that shield was gone. The guard had shattered it with nothing more than his presence. Darren's fingers clenched the edge of the windowsill as the weight of his failure pressed down on him. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the Black Royal Guard had looked at him. It wasn't with anger or hatred or even pity. It was just calm. A calmness that seemed to say everything Darren had tried to hold on to was meaningless now. That his power, his pride, his past, none of it mattered in the face of the guard's quiet strength. He thought back to the days when he had been at the top, when he had walked these halls with a sense of purpose, when soldiers had saluted him and the people had looked up to him. He had once been a man of honor, of strength, but now, standing here in the silence of the palace, he felt like a ghost of that man, a man who had failed, who had lost his place. As he looked out at the garden, he tried to focus on something, anything, other than the past, but it was impossible. His memories of power and respect only made the present more painful. The Black Royal Guard's calm response had cut through the years of arrogance and pride that had built up inside him. Darren had tried to command respect, but it had been taken from him the moment he had been dismissed from his post. Now, no matter how hard he tried, it felt like he could never regain what he had lost. He remembered the voices in the courtyard, the way the crowd had watched him, waiting for him to fall. And when he had, there had been no sympathy, only quiet judgment. It was as if they had all known what he had refused to accept, that his time had passed, that he was no longer the man he once was. His hands trembled slightly as he let go of the windowsill and stepped back. The truth was clear now, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had failed. Not just in the courtyard, but in every decision that had led him here. He had allowed his pride to blind him, to make him believe that power was something that could be regained. But it wasn't, not like this. Darren turned away from the window, the cold feeling of loss settling deep within him. He couldn't change what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn to accept it, to live with it, even if it was the hardest thing he had ever done. Darren walked through the empty halls of the palace, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. It was late, and most of the palace had fallen into a quiet stillness. He hadn't been able to sleep, not after everything that had happened. His mind refused to settle, constantly replaying the scene in the courtyard, the words he had shouted, and the guard's calm response. Everything felt wrong. Everything felt lost. He reached the grand staircase and stopped, looking down at the dark, open space below. The palace was vast, too big for a man like him to ever feel truly at home now. He had once been someone who could walk these halls with his head high, a man of authority and respect. But now he felt like an outsider in a place he should have known better than anyone. His fingers brushed the railing as he slowly descended the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. In the quiet, his thoughts circled back to the Black Royal Guard, the way the guard had stood still, unaffected by his anger. It was as if nothing could touch him. It was a power Darren had never understood, and it both terrified and fascinated him. Darren had spent years building up his reputation, his pride, his sense of control. He had thought that power was something that could be taken back once lost, something that could be regained with enough force. But he was beginning to understand that he had been wrong. The guard hadn't needed to fight him. He had simply existed, and in doing so, he had shown Darren the painful truth. That strength wasn't about dominance or fear. It was about something deeper, something Darren had lost along the way. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself standing before the large wooden doors that led outside to the garden. The air was cool, and the night was quiet, save for the distant sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Darren pushed the doors open, stepping into the open space. The garden was empty, bathed in the soft light of the moon. It felt like a different world, a world where nothing had changed, where the past still held its beauty. But even here, the weight of his failure lingered. He walked through the garden, his hands shoved into his pockets, the cold air brushing against his face. The flowers seemed to mock him, their bright colors a reminder of how far he had fallen. He had once been someone who could command anything, but now he was just a man wandering in the dark. The Black Royal Guard's words had never come. There had been no insults, no challenge, just silence. That silence had been the most painful thing of all, because in that silence, Darren had realized that no one needed to speak to break him. No one needed to fight him to make him feel small. The world had already moved on without him. His place in it had already been taken, and nothing he did now could change that. He stopped in the middle of the garden, staring up at the stars, and for the first time in a long time, Darren felt the weight of his own regret. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling, but it was also a reminder that he could never go back to the man he had been, the man who had been full of pride. Now, all that was left was acceptance, and that, he knew, was the hardest part of all. Darren stood alone in the middle of the garden, the cool night air swirling around him. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the quiet space. He had walked here without thinking, driven by something he couldn't explain, a need to escape the weight of the palace of his own thoughts. The silence of the garden was different from the silence he had felt in the palace, though. Here, it didn't feel heavy or suffocating. It felt like a chance to breathe, to think without the constant pressure of the past. He looked down at his hands, The same hands that had once held the power to command armies, to give orders that could change lives. Now those hands felt empty. Nothing he did now could restore what he had lost. He couldn't just will his way back to the man he had been. It wasn't that simple. His thoughts drifted back to the Black Royal Guard, the calm soldier who had never spoken a word, never raised a hand, but had still defeated him. He hadn't needed to be strong or loud or powerful. All he had needed was to stand there, silent and still. And that stillness had shattered Darren's pride, broken the illusion that he could control everything around him. Darren had been so sure of his own importance, his own strength, that he had never understood what real power was. It wasn't about forcing others to bow or demanding respect through fear. It was about something deeper, something the guard had shown him without even trying. It was about knowing who you were, being at peace with yourself, no matter what others thought or did. Darren hadn't understood that, not until now. As he stood there, the night growing colder, he realized that he had been chasing something he could never have again, a place of power, a seat at the top. But that place had been taken from him, and there was no going back. The life he had known, the man he had been, was gone. The palace, the respect, the fear, all of it was part of a past he could never return to. But maybe that wasn't the worst thing. Maybe the worst thing was that he had been so blind to the truth for so long. He had spent years chasing a dream of power, of control, where the real strength had always been something else. The Black Royal Guard hadn't needed to chase anything. He had been at peace with himself. And maybe that was something Darren needed to learn. That strength didn't come from force, from pride, or from trying to control everything around you. It came from within, from accepting who you were, flaws and all. Darren let out a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. The regret that had once weighed so heavily on him started to feel lighter. He wasn't sure if he could change, if he could ever fully let go of the past. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to know that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. A way to find strength, not in what he had lost, but in what he could still learn. He turned away from the garden and started walking back toward the palace, the quiet stillness of the night following him. Things had changed. He had changed. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all.